Hello, and thanks for sticking around for this discussion for the Witmans. We're glad that you're here. I'm Brian Tam. I'm the Executive Director of IFFBoston, and we've got a great team today to talk about the film. And so I want to bring them up to the virtual stage. So first, I want to bring up David Petersen, the director. Hello, David.
How are you? Glad to be here.
And then producers Nick Diener. Hi, Nick.
Hello, everybody.
Gregory Timmons. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi there. And Shannon Sun-Higginson. Welcome all. And to moderate this conversation, we've got from Toronto, writer and critic Jason Gorber. Welcome back, Jason.
Good morning.
Really looking for this discussion. So Jason, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. It's a very provocative film. It's a very challenging film. And I know it's one that took many, many years to accomplish. I'm just wondering if somebody could talk about the journey of making this, of going from the initial short to the eventual feature film, and the way not only did the film change, but the production team changed, and obviously the events portrayed in the film changed.
Yeah. So Gregory and myself and a mutual acquaintance of ours, Joe Lee, initially contacted the Witmans. Joe contacted them directly at first, and we basically established a friendship, listened to their story, and shot a short film that came out, I believe, about a year after our first meeting or somewhere in that time frame, and did pretty well. It was a student film. It was Joe's thesis film at Temple University. And we won a few small awards, and the story was clearly not finished. The Witmans were in this wild legal purgatory between various appeals, and we were super sympathetic to their sort of perspective on everything and wanted to continue working on things. And then at some point, I want to say maybe a year or two later, Shannon, you were introduced to the project. And from there, we all decided, hey, there's really a lot of meat to the story that hasn't been addressed in any serious way, certainly not by the short film. We'd love to continue just working on it, following the story. Again, they were still in legal purgatory between, I believe at that point, it was the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and then a question of whether or not they would take it to the federal district court in the region. So there was just a lot hanging, waiting to be sort of picked, low-hanging fruit. And then we started to cast about for some production partners, and we ended up, through Shannon, making contact with 0.0, and that's how we came to befriend and work with David Petersen. And from there, it's really just a story of how everything started to move. There was the case at the Supreme Court in the United States that ruled that indefinite or lifelong imprisonment of minors was cruel and unusual punishment, and I think that was the primary driver to the story, essentially. It moved everything forward. It made the York County DAs feel the need to offer or to directly communicate and build some sort of an escape hatch for Zach. And then the Witmans decided to go with that, and that's kind of where we were at that point, really just following as things were progressing, because it was pretty rapid. And then not too long after Zach was released, we ended up with something very close to what you have probably just watched, and that's kind of the story in the nutshell.
Shannon, if you could talk about coming into a project that obviously they had already developed, for lack of a better word, an intimacy with their subjects, and you're coming in obviously with your own perspectives on the story, but just ensuring sort of a different point of view, something coming in that might have a little bit more distance from the sort of initial moments that sort of contributed to the earlier doc. If you could talk about what that was like of coming into this world and finding your way around not only the narrative, but the real lives of these people.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Nick, for the overview, and thanks, Jason, for having us. Yeah, when I came into this project, I was moving to Philadelphia. I think it was 2014 is how long I've been on it, and I wasn't even one of the originators. So that's to give you a little bit of an idea of scale. And I was introduced to the team of creators, and I was really coming in as a producer-minded producer, meaning sort of organizing the interviews, figuring out like what information we had, what information we had to gain, and then, you know, eventually making this partnership with our production partner, which actually got the film to the finishing line. So I think, like everyone, I mean, Dave can speak to his experience as well coming on as a director, but I think a lot of us who come onto the project, you know, we sort of view it as like, did he do it? Didn't he do it? Right? And we're always looking for the evidence in one way or another, and then just sort of trying to analyze different things, like analyzing the 911 call, for example, asking questions for our interview subjects about like specifically whether or not he did it. But one thing I learned over time, I did develop a very close relationship with the Witmans, particularly Sue. I talked to her 2 days ago or something. I have to call her for Mother's Day. But you know, I sort of, like Nick and Greg, sort of entered the fold. We are all very close to the Witman family. We see them frequently, sort of without any camera or at any pretense of we're filming this, we're doing this for the documentary. And, you know, that was a really important part of this production is developing this close relationship. And that ultimately became sort of the root, I think, of a lot of the most impactful scenes in the film. Those are the moments that I'm really proud of, and I think are most significant, the emotionally poignant moments sort of with Ron and Sue, sort of painting this portrait of this family rather than trying to get into the nitty gritty of like the whodunit component. So that was sort of, I don't know how necessarily I developed that intimacy, but I think it was easy with Nick and Greg already there, already having this close relationship. There is another element, which is obviously their son who was murdered is named Greg, and the three of us are around the ages of Zach and Greg as well. So we sort of think of them as sort of parental figures, and that definitely develops a very close relationship.
David, if you could talk about joining the same sort of process. I know that you've been on also for many years. And just talk about sort of joining this already established, very close and intimate relationship with the subject, which is not always the way that many documentarians work.
Yeah, it was great to see their short film. And when I was approached by 0.0, whose founders I've known, I went to the founder's wedding, you know, it's just like, it goes back that far with them. And so they presented me with their sort of trailer of what they thought this film was about. And I hated the trailer because I felt like it was kind of more about, it seemed sort of like a scurrilous murder story rather than something that was really a social issue or a human interest story. So then I saw their short film. I said, oh, I like this. You know, I said, I can see their character. And, but all the materials that were presented to me, I just had that sort of knee-jerk reaction. Oh, well, what is this story? Is this a story about delusionment on the side of the parents? Because I just assumed, oh, it's a clear-cut case. I mean, who else could have done it? He did it. So I went down. I remember that first day I went down to meet Nick, Greg. I think I met Shannon later, but and then to meet the parents, because I said, I got to talk to these parents because there are something, you know, Ron and Sue, there's something there. I have to talk to them. So I first met with Nick and Greg, and you know, they offered some details of the case that started to make me question, you know, the presentation of the facts. And then I met them, and I sat down in their living room, And I asked them, I said, so did you ask Zach if he did it? And they said, oh yeah, we looked him in the eye, and it's in the film. And they said, there's no possible way he could have done it. And then I started to really, my whole mirror started to warp, as it did for the next, I don't know, 3-4 years. I don't remember how many years it's been, but it really started to shift and change. And I started to look at the case as a case of a tragic case, a case of tragedy. And then that changed my whole paradigm about the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system. And I felt that that was the center work of this question, do we treat a crime as a tragedy or as a crime? Are we, a social family like the Witmans as a family? And what is our responsibility? Whether or not you believe Zach did it, the whole question is, what is our social responsibility for our children? And that deepened and broadened the film. And of course, their unending grief for both their children.
We're going to get into the hard question now. One of the lawyers, the defense lawyer that they were very upset with, makes the point that it doesn't matter to him whether the person is guilty or not, that the same process takes place, that it's a question of justice, not about what actually happened. How did your reaction change when the narrative changed and you had somebody state on the record that they committed this murder, that story that they told their parents by looking them in the eye on legal grounds was a lie? How did that change how you reacted to the story? And how did it shift the creation of the documentary once that revelation took place? We'll start with you, David, because you're the ostensive director.
Well, that whole question of revelation and truth and lies is a deeper legal question, right? Because there was a plea bargain. There were shifts and changes to the way what Zach faced in terms of his imprisonment. You have life without parole, and Supreme Court ruled that was cruel and unusual. So there's the machinations of the legal system that made it possible for him to work out a plea bargain. I'm not going to get into the issues about whether or not there's truth in his statements or not, because I think Zach had to make some decisions. And, in the film, you see that Sue doesn't agree with those decisions. Whether or not I believe in the plea, that's sort of immaterial. Again, it sort of I never wavered from what anchored me in the film. And what anchored me in the film is this question of, I interviewed Ian Manuel, who was a kid, we never put him in the film, but he was a kid who was a client of Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson was the lawyer who argued in the Supreme Court about the cruel and unusual punishment and won, essentially. And Ian Manuel was a kid who did it, right? He shot this woman in the face, and he, at 13, was sentenced to life without parole. Now, he's black, Zach was white, and I said, here it is. Zach is a canary in the coal mine for juvenile justice, that it is not, when in the 90s they ruled them essentially super predators, all children, suddenly children were like children of the corn, they were just some frightening, fearful, murderous antichrist, whereas children are children, and Zach is my brother. Whether or not he did it or not, I have to take a look at that from a sympathetic humanitarian point of view. So really, all the machinations of that never changed for me.
Nick and Gregory, you've been with the story the longest. It's that notion, again, I'm not looking to settle anything here. I just want to get your reaction to the shifts in the narrative. You both have admitted you're extremely close to the story, yet you had a obligation as filmmakers to allow the story to unfold as it did, to not put a thumb on the scale, as it were, of the story of justice that you're telling. If both of you could talk on a personal basis about how all these shifts, how living with the story for so long has affected you as filmmakers, and how it shifted the narrative that you guys helped tell.
Sure. I think for me, it was definitely at that pivotal point where the plea bargain came up. I think I'm still speaking to maybe your last question, but that completely shifted the direction that the film would take and would eventually shape its final form later. And I think I was aware that there could be a plea bargain from the very onset. From when we first met Ron and Sue, they had said, this is nothing new. This is something that was offered originally in 2003, I believe, when he went to trial. And so it might be something that crops up at some point. And I never fully understood the ramifications of what that would do to how we told the story or what we would be capturing or focusing on. So when that happened, my world flipped upside down in how I had to process this. And I had a personal struggle on the morality of making the film at all at one point. So I think for me, this film has been, it's been very informative to me as just a creator of content. I think I'm much more involved in thinking critically and deeply on topics and subjects. I take the ancillary side views and trajectories that a story might evolve to become much more seriously. And for me, it really educated me a lot on documentary filmmaking. I think when I stepped into this role, I was very naive in thinking, okay, I'm getting into this. We've got an incredible story to tell. It's very emotional. It's from a perspective that's not often heard, a pariah of the community of sorts. And I thought, this is really going to be some sort of world-changing story. And the final form of the film is very different than what I had initially thought we would be creating. So I think for me, it was very humbling to know that the story tells itself as it unfolds, and that I act only as a conduit to purvey how things unfolded and do my best to have an equilibrium brought to the storyline. And for me, that was a pretty profound lesson to learn.
Nick, I'd love to hear from you, but I'd also love to hear about other films that have dealt with, let's say, similar ethos. Something I think of Paradise Lost. I think of a documentary where you go in with certain expectations. Those expectations are messed with. In some ways, the expectations of coming into this film is, well, of course, this is going to be a question of the justice system is broken, and the person is clearly not going to be guilty, and that's what's going to take place here. This is a much more complicated narrative, namely that the injustice is the charge, not necessarily what happened or didn't happen during the case. If you could just talk about your own reaction to all of these complexities and how your own views shifted over the decades of you working on this film.
Yeah, well, so one of the primary things that I think we were just forced to leave on the editing floor is a whole thematic bulwark, really, between the intense complexity of all of this decision making between the Witmans, their legal counsel, Zach, and what actually makes its way out into the public. There is an immense divide between those two things. And to understand the Witmans and sort of, let's say, the behind the scenes complexity and chaos is to more or less discount anything that anybody from the public and the outside might have, ideas they might have about how things actually transpired. It's really intensely difficult to say, no, actually, Zach the entire time knew that there was a calculus going on. He needed to say, I am innocent, until it became very clear that that was not the most expeditious way of mitigating an unjust sentencing. So the decision was not necessarily, and I'm speaking extemporaneously, certainly not any sort of comment on the legal veracity of anything that actually took place. But there was a calculus going on about, okay, what are my options here? Am I going to languish in jail for however many more decades until there's a retrial or something else significant that could reduce my sentence, or do I just plead guilty and get out and have a life, whatever semblance of a life he's able to actually put together at this point in time? Those are intensely difficult conversations to have, and ostensibly he was having those since the day he was put under house arrest and was trying to figure out how things would go. They did all think that he was going to be proven innocent, if not by the evidence, then just by the lack of evidence and the lack of due process in how everything was being investigated. But they were just really unlucky with the lawyers. So there's a lot to be said about how difficult it is to actually fully transmit this story and to compress what's actually happening and get it understood by an audience. We initially thought, oh, this has to be a series. There's no way we can just compress this down into a feature film. There are so many things to talk about. Every one of our pitch meetings, if that's what you want to call them, or that just the times that we spoke with other producers, hours and hours and hours on end of question and answer, 5 hours here, 4 hours there, talking about details, this thing, that thing, pouring through trial transcripts, and then finding these incredible, unique takes on things. I'm thinking specifically of Dave McLaughlin's sort of viewpoint, 20 years removed from the actual case. There's so much to be said for once you know everything, then it becomes clear that there was a miscarriage of justice going on. But from the outside, and I'll admit this freely, you look at it and you say, if I'm going to be a Bayesian, if I'm going to put probabilities to this, he probably did it. That, how else could you really, what sort of mental calculus could you employ to come to any other decision? He was in the house. His brother ended up dead. He called 911, and the rest is more or less history. But
I want to bring Shannon into this in a sec, but I just want to get to this whole notion. Because is the miscarriage of justice that it was a justice system that convicted a child under adult charges? Is that the central miscarriage of justice? Or is the miscarriage of justice that somebody was falsely accused? Those are two separate things, and your film certainly weighs one way versus the other. I just wonder if you can be very specific about that.
Yeah, so I think we made a decision to make a special point about the juvenile justice system, and I think that's completely valid. The deeper, more macroscopic view of things really is that there's an issue here wherein, even though it is said innocent until proven guilty, it's actually psychologically and publicly and from the exterior almost always the opposite. It is guilt, and there's a real paradigm shift between those two positions. There's a real axiom to be discussed, and it's pretty infrequent that anybody gets to make any progress in that arena, because so much of it is couched in details, and you end up losing the plot, really, which is that people being accused of something ought to be given every chance to demonstrate their innocence. And the justice system should be skewed in such a way that it would minimize innocent people being put in jail for any crime, really. And that's just not how it seems to work. I think we're pretty vindictive creatures, all things considered, and it's very easy to manipulate us to believe that something needs to be done, rather than, in some cases, nothing, really.
And
Shannon, if you could talk about...
I should point out that it's innocent until proven guilty. So it
Right.
is up to the state to prove the guilt, not up to the defendant to prove that they didn't do it. And that is also an injustice in terms of
Right.
the trial itself, because it was all circumstantial evidence. They're just, and because there was no other suspect, then the jury assumed, as I did, until I was looked deeply at the forensics, the family, the history, motive, all of those other things that we look at.
Oh, well, I'll come back to David. Thank you so much for that, Shannon. If you could talk, as my phone's ringing, Shannon, if you could discuss, if you could discuss the proximity that you talked about getting so close to these individuals. What was that like as a filmmaker, and how challenging was it there then to do the cuts that were required to actually tell a general narrative, not a specific narrative? This is not a home video. You are not doing this as a case exhibit. You're making a film. I don't think you're promising objectivity, but you're certainly promising that you're not simply providing one narrow perspective. Talk about the difficulty of that, of maybe showing some things that the family might not want of you to have shown, of going down narrative threads that maybe the family wasn't necessarily comfortable with. All of that taking place within the context of you still needing to have access to these individuals and their lives.
Right. That's a really great question. I mean, I think, as Nick said, when we sort of came onto this, or specifically when I came onto the project, I was definitely thinking of it as a series, because there was just so much information. There was so much evidence. The case was so drawn out and long. There were so many complicating factors. And, the way we were initially thinking of it is like, we'll do one episode where we kind of push you one way, and then at the end we'll push you the other way, and then we'll spend the next episode going the other way, and then we'll push you back. Innocent, guilty, innocent, guilty. We ultimately decided that, first of all, we don't know what happened. We don't claim to know what happened. And that's a really important thing. I feel like too often in sort of crime documentary, it seems like the filmmaker is not only manipulating you to think one way or another, but also like they seem to think that they know what happened, which, I mean, I don't think the criminal justice system knows. I think there are 1 to 2 people who know what happened, right? So we'll just say we were not trying to sort of shape the viewer's opinion in that way. And I think because of that, that made it a lot easier in ways in the edit to sort of portray everything as fairly as we felt was possible. Unfortunately, we did have to leave some pieces of information out of the final edit because, there was more than enough for a 10-hour series, right? So there were things on the cutting room floor, and I guess that's sort of where our hand, kind of moved maybe the viewer's opinion. But one thing we wanted to do, and I think we did succeed at that, is we didn't want anyone to come out of it who was in the film to feel like they had been portrayed unfairly. And we were very proud to show it to anyone who was involved. And obviously there are people who have very differing opinions in this film. And so I think, ultimately, that's how sort of we landed as far as giving justice to the story without, making the case for Zach's innocence, not making a film that is just quote unquote proving his innocence, even though that's not, as David said, it's not anybody's responsibility to prove innocence. So we weren't necessarily concerned. I mean, the biggest concern for us as far as Ron and Sue was how much we were showing of the crime scene itself, the evidence photos, and that was something that we very strongly agreed upon beforehand, to minimize like the actual violence that is visible on screen. We did not want it to be sensationalized in that way. We didn't want it to be, we kind of wanted this to be a different kind of film where we leave it up to the viewer, what they think in the end. We trust the viewer to come to their own decision. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what we think. And no offense to the viewers, it doesn't really matter what they think either. We just wanted to portray all of the elements of this crime, this investigation, and ultimately this case that weren't shown by the media up until we made the film.
David, if you could sort of obviously expand about that. I still want to get it back about whether there were specific films that you looked at to allow you a sort of narrative framework in order to navigate this. I'm not taking away any of your experience as a filmmaker, but if there's certain things that you knew that had addressed similar subjects about how to navigate something as complex as this. And some of the most, one of the more sort of emotionally complicated moments is when the mother is lying down at the spot where her child has died. Yeah. We see things like that. On the other hand, we know that there's a great deal of rage between this couple when all the clothing is left on the floor, but we don't see. There's so much of this film that we don't see, that we have to interpret, that we have to see secondhand. We have to accept so many people at face. Literally, they look in your eye and tell you something, and these stories one of them is not accurate. So if you could talk about the challenge of that, of bringing an audience into something that is necessarily complicated, but still get across the notion that somewhere underneath all of this are notions of fairness and justice that can be discussed within the framework of this story without taking anything away by how close you are with these individuals and this family that have brought you into their lives.
Yeah, I think that there were two sort of separate worlds in a way, because there is, of course, the issue of social justice. I'd read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, and very moved by that. Very moved by just the whole notion that somewhere I connected Zach to being a canary in the coal mine, because I knew that if people were listening to a story that might have been, say, an African American or a minority figure, they might not have listened as much. I would have, of course, made an entire film about Ian Manuel, but the point is that I was in this story and I was watching it unfold, right? Just like Greg, just like Nick, just like Shannon, we were watching it without expectation. We didn't know what was going to happen, and we had to respond. Okay, here's the plea bargain. Okay, we have to be there for the phone call. Or here's a central lawyer call. We just watched it unfold. We didn't know, and for the longest time, we were sitting and waiting. There was nothing going on in their lives, and so we had to somehow portray that. And we had so many challenges. Like I call it sort of a mixture of Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People and Henrik Ibsen's A Dollhouse. We were stuck in this house in which they never left, and we never could film them with their friends, and they didn't see their friends, so they were pariahs. So all we could do the most we could do is film them walking their dogs. That was it. That was the life of their everyday lives. And nothing happened until there was a breakthrough with with the state trying to create a plea bargain. So there we were, kind of going down this train of that train. And then, of course, there's this other thing where we heard about this tip of someone who had heard a neighbor, they had the same knife. And so, I went down there to interview her. It was a miracle that she was willing to talk on camera. She was very scared of, very afraid of just revealing her identity. But that all happened kind of after, during the time that this plea bargain was going on. So then my mind was blown, because I said, so what then do we do? What if, is anyone free to investigate this very significant lead to a potential other murderer? And of course not, of course not, because here we were in the system. And then, I've just watched, all of us watched, Nick, Greg, and Shannon, all of us just kind of watched the water rise in the tub. And I think Sue was really the one that was the most vocal, that she said, we're drowning, and then I thought about all the kids in Philly, in all the urban cities in America, also drowning from the same kind of injustice of the juvenile justice system. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how we sort of came to a finish. Is we said, well, here's Zach, he's released from prison. And I love that moment, that last shot where he's just looking around, just looking at the trees, listening to the squirrels. And he's for the first time sort of taking in his freedom. And I'm hoping that no one really has a judgment quite, or maybe they do, or maybe they don't. But here is this kid who entered prison and the system at 15 and is now released, 21 years later.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with this responsibility?
I'll keep trying, whether there were specific references that you drew upon, whether or not you did or not.
References, Joe Berlinger, of course, Paradise Lost, of course. I'm actually working with his editor right now on another film, Mickey Milmore, who edited, the second Paradise Lost, and worked with Joe all the time. So yes, there's certainly a lot of references. Charles Burnett, because I just love this notion of children at play, and the children, sort of the innocence of children, and just the observational standpoint. Of course, all the Maisels, all Pennebaker's work, and all of the the iterations of that in contemporary filmmaking. And of course, Joe, had all of that cinema verite training. So a lot of that is what, when I first saw this footage, I said, well, there's a lot of interviews, and there's a lot of stylized sort of recreations. And I said, I don't know, let's just get to these these parents and just look at their grief in real time, even though they could do nothing except maybe go through letters, go through albums, go, walk their dogs. But, that grief, that unmistakable and, just driving grief pervaded everything they did. And so that is the most astonishing thing about it, is we're watching that unfold.
I am not doing the simplest thing that film critics do all the time, which is complain about what's not in a film. It's just labor. That being said, the one person we do not hear from directly about the events of that day, and you had opportunity, was Zach. Zach tells his parents looking at them in the eyes, but he does not tell the audience looking at them in the eyes. If you could talk about the narrative, editorial, and production decision to not have Zach's direct participation in him telling his story.
That was pretty clear from Zach himself. He voiced pretty early on that he would have nothing to do with the film, and maintained that to this day. I think his that was not a decision that any of us had any sort of weight or clout in making. That was sort of a boundary that existed that we had to work within.
And he, just to jump off that, he only through like much pressure through his parents even agreed to participate in the release. Like that, the small moment that he is in the film, we had to, you know, sort of squeeze as much out of that as possible. But that was after they basically said, you know, these kids, as they call us the kids, the three of us. And they basically said, you know, the kids have been with us for 6 years at this point. Like, you have to let them shoot this part because they're trying to tell your story. And so he reluctantly agreed to that. But
Shannon, that absolutely
all you have.
Yeah, no, but Shannon, that absolutely gets to my point, right? So people are going to look at this, and some people are going to say, you guys were way too close to the subject. Like, that's going to happen. You guys know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The advantage of you being so close to your subjects is you got the ending of your film. You would, the easiest thing for them to have done is to close you out from their lives at the most critical point, which is the reuniting of their one surviving son. Given all of that, as filmmakers, this clearly is going to reshape the way that you actually deal with narratives like this. You've become very, very close to this. I'm wondering, sort of as dealing with that, this has clearly affected you personally, the ups and downs of this storyline, but also professionally. So we'll start with Shannon, then we'll sort of go around again. You could talk about that, about the division between professional responsibility to maintain objectivity, but the also professional responsibility to be close enough with your subject to actually get the movie made that you need to make.
Really, when it came down to it, if we had to decide whether to re-traumatize this family and make a really amazing film, or, you know, maintain as much sort of calm and sanity as they can have, and some comfort in their lives, and ultimately not make a film, we would pick the latter. I think all of us would pick it every time. You know, there are ways to look at documentary film that are more distance, and you're trying to tell a greater story, and, you know, ultimately, like, people may not particularly care about maintaining those relationships afterwards. My personal ethos is we're humans trying to tell human stories about other humans. So I don't necessarily, I don't feel strongly about maintaining distance in a way. And I think in many ways that was our strength in this film. I think that is, you know, one thing that I always bring to productions as a producer. I always try to have like a close human connection, no matter what the subject is. So I don't necessarily see the conflict because I don't think of us as, okay, well, we have to maintain. I mean, I do think we actually maintain pretty good journalistic standards, even though we were so close to the subjects, because we didn't participate in anything unethical. We didn't pay anybody off, and we didn't manipulate the footage in a way that any of the subjects would deem unfair. So in a way, we were still able to maintain those journalistic standards, but I personally, as a filmmaker, don't feel any conflict between having a close personal relationship with subjects and portraying them in a fair way.
And Greg and Nick, I want to go to you, but there's a very specific scene where he's walking to the courthouse, and he looks directly into the barrel of the camera, the NBC camera, and says, "You vultures!" And then he looks into one of your cameras. I don't know which one of you was shooting at the time.
That was me.
And in the moment, you can actually see is like, "Oh, you're vultures, but you're not." If you could talk about, and of course, after calling them vultures, he then gives his interview to the same camera person. So if you could talk about that balance, that look, you guys have lived with this story. You have lived with these individuals. You have a responsibility for them as persons, as human beings, but you also must have at some point in time an editorial distance from what it is that you're covering. The two of you probably had a greater challenge than anybody on that front. If you could both discuss that.
Yeah, I think I think we need to. I need to go out on a limb and just say that I think the lines were blurry between, you know, editorially making a film and then maintaining that relationship at times. But Ron and Sue really, honestly, are incredible humans, and I have the utmost respect for them. And it was their flexibility in knowing that they were asking for a film to be made, and they understood that there's a duality to this, and there's not just two sides of the coin. You know, a coin is 3D. There's three sides to this. They understood that there were many facets, and I think it was their flexibility in being able to understand, process, and be okay with the fact that we were looking to be as objective as possible. And that is all purely on them. So none of this was anything that we forced upon the situation. It wasn't something that we crafted. It wasn't really ever a conversation. It was Ron and Sue and their perspective on the world and what this film would be, and their understanding and knowing that we care enough to not damage them, but ultimately they wanted this film to be made, and it was their decision, and they had to sort of, I think, accept what they were asking for, and with all things that come with it. So I just want to, put that on Ron and Sue and commend them for how flexible and incredible they are as a couple and as people dealing with unending grief. I have tremendous respect for them, despite what viewers may think about the family as a whole, good or bad. I'm, fully knowing them as personally as I do. I commend them endlessly.
Nick, same question. And would you have cameras shoved in your face at a time of grief like this?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty extraordinary for them to have invited that. So there's a few things that I think are all sort of interrelated, one of which we talked about just a bit ago, which is that Zach not wanting to be involved was, I think, probably an extension of something he heard from his lawyers during the very first trial, which was that no matter what you do, it's going to be misconstrued as an indication of your guilt, whether or not you are contrite, you're crying, you're trying to maybe you're hamming it up. But if you're very serious and wooden, maybe that's an indication of sociopathy or something like that. So there was very little upside, I think, to his participation in any way that wasn't just simply, okay, you can see me being normal in life, but I'm not necessarily going to talk to you. And we've seen that borne out now over several interviews, Q&A sessions, and clubhouses, where people are pretty solidly convinced of his guilt, despite everything we tell them. And which is not to say that we're trying to necessarily prove innocence. Again, it's more that we're just trying to say, hey, this wasn't a properly conducted justice process. But to us staying objective, that was something that I thought was extraordinary from the time that I first met Ron and Sue, which was them being very, very ready to acknowledge what the situation looked like. But then being very, very upset also that it was being misportrayed in the local newspapers, in the media, and needing very desperately to say their piece about how things transpired. I think that's maybe the largest component of why they were interested in participating in this in the first place, is that they felt as though they had just been very much prosecuted and found guilty in the public's eye, and had never really had a chance to talk back, to offer their perspective. And that's what you see when Ron comes up there and looks down the barrel of the news camera and calls them vultures, because that was his experience. And not that I don't think a small part of him was ready and willing and interested in presenting his own perspective, because he was. But they had, I think, from the very beginning thought, okay, this needs to be very well constructed, and it needs to have a balance to it that isn't being portrayed in media, in the local media specifically, and that will do us much more good than what has been done up until that point, everything that's been written about the case and all that kind of stuff. And for us, I think it became really quite simple. A lot of like Greg was saying, a lot of those decisions were kind of made for us. I can't count the number of times that Ron and Sue more or less said, oh, from this perspective, this is how it is. So there was a lot of sort of theory of mind going on in their thought processes where they knew other people had come to these conclusions erroneously or were just going off of their best information. But they wanted to present their information, and they knew that it was going to be a difficult process for us. Sue says it all the time, how she marvels at the fact that we're able to sort of make everything cohere and still not come down too heavily on either side. And I think that is maybe just a testament to us sort of allowing the film to grow and take us where it needed to go organically. I'm sure I speak for everybody in saying that we had a million ideas that we all think would have made the film that much better. But what we got out of it is a very sort of naturalistic. It just had to be done this way, and these were the constraints, time-wise, and we just had to kind of put it together in a way that the material was informing the structure. And yeah, that's kind of what we ended up with, I think.
And David, you get the last word. In any way, as carefully as you're being and as close as you are to the core of the narrative, is in some ways inevitably as a documentarian, you're a vulture.
Oh, always. We're always vultures. And maybe we're vultures of pain, vultures of grief, and vultures of injustice, because that wouldn't make a good story. So yeah, we're there. We are picking at, the liver of the suffering. But there are other components that I think were brought up in the last thing that Shannon, Greg, and Nick mentioned, is this notion of trust, of allegiance to the material itself, which is something sort of outside of selling a story or selling someone's pain or grief or injustice, is that, we had to develop just trust, not just with Ron and Sue, but with the whole side of the prosecution, to get Tim Barker on board and to get even David McLaughlin, who's the defense attorney who had, misgivings about being, all of that was about trust, right? That we were going to try to honor the material itself, and that if that is the moral compass for a documentarian, to say, speak truth, speak truth in every frame, let the footage tell the story, then I think you're kind of grounded in a way. So you don't have to make a political film or an advocacy film, but you just say, let's be mindful observers.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. This was a very long conversation, but I really appreciate you guys engaging with it. Congratulations on the film, and congratulations on playing IFFBoston, one of the great festivals in the world. So thank you so much for your participation and your frank honesty and your responses today.
Thank you.
On behalf of the festival, I want to thank all of you as well. Jason, thanks for moderating this. And David, Nick, Shannon, Gregory, thanks so much for sharing your film with us. And thanks for taking the time to share this conversation with our audience. We truly appreciate it. Thanks to everyone watching this, and take care, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.